Hi again, Rob here. This is Confessions of a Crap Programmer, episode 5, and this is the first episode about drawing graphics in Z80 assembly. As always, I'm working on the Sam Coupé, but I'm sure that some of these ideas and techniques will translate to other 8-bit or 16-bit systems. At the end of this video, I'm finally going to reply to a comment that was made after the first episode of this series that's relevant to this episode. So, when I started learning Z80 assembly on the Sam, I had a plan that involved knocking out maybe half a dozen games a year. And a big part of my plan was that right away I was going to put together a routine for drawing a sprite with transparency and another one for sprites without, and then use those two routines to bash out all of my games nice and quickly. I soon learned, however, that that's not really how you do things on these old computers, especially if you need a lot of fast-moving sprites. In fact, you pretty much end up writing routines to draw graphics in lots of different ways to suit the specific needs of each sprite or even each individual frame of animation for a sprite. All of this really slows me down, and it constantly forces me to do things that I'm not naturally very good at, and I wasn't really even that interested in stuff like this to begin with. It can get very gutty creating faster sprite routines, even if you make tools to automate some of the really boring bits. Fortunately, I wasn't on my own getting started, as I was lucky enough to be in touch with an amazing programmer in the Sam Coupé scene, Chris Pyle, who created ProDOS for running CPM software on the Sam Coupé, as well as two absolutely impeccable game conversions, Battlezone and Defender. Chris showed me some really clever tricks for making things easier and faster, and also some efficient ways of handling graphics that I still use today. I'm going to explain a few fundamental details as we look at some of these tricks, because there are a few things that I found really confusing to start with. So, before we create any drawing routines, let's take a quick look at how graphics work on the Sam Coupé. We can zoom in on a sprite here. I've cleaned up the pixels where zooming in makes things all blurry, and I'm going to select a pair of pixels to have a look at how they work. The Sam Coupé uses packed pixels in its 16 colour mode, where a single byte holds 2 pixels. This is something that I found extremely confusing when I was getting started, because I'd learnt how a byte works, with each bit of an 8-bit number representing a value like this to make a decimal number between 0 and 255. But that's not how things work with packed pixels like this. In this context, you treat each nibble as a separate 4-bit number from decimal 0 to 15. So I don't know which palette numbers are actually being used for this sprite in Defender, but if these colours were palette numbers 4 and 5, then the bits for this pair would be set like this. Colour 0 will almost always be black, or whatever your main background colour is, and it will be in these examples. And I should mention that colour 15 will be white. So, assuming that HL has been set to the screen address we want to draw to, the simplest way of drawing these 2 pixels is with a single load HL like this. You get 2 pixels drawn in a single operation, but it does create the obvious problem of how to move a sprite by a single pixel on screen. Shifting bytes 4 bits left or right would be extremely slow. So a really clever trick that Chris showed me is to have 2 versions of the sprites that need to move by a single pixel, like this, with one drawn aligned to the full byte, and 1 drawn offset by a single pixel. I've found that the best way to make use of this is to draw your sprites with an odd number of pixels horizontally so that both versions use the same number of bytes for each row like this. If you can't do this, then it's not the end of the world, but it does mean that your nibble shifted sprite will need an extra byte for each row, which will use up a few more CPU ticks to draw. The only downside with this method is that your sprite now uses twice as much memory. But anyway, now I'll make a sprite routine to demonstrate how to use this technique using another trick Chris showed me that makes the whole process very easy. I'm going to use the template that I created for Sam Coupé programs in episode 3, but you'll see that I've switched over to using a single halt instruction to wait for an interrupt that Stefan showed me how to do in the comments for that episode. I've added a colour palette by deleting 16 of the knops from the top of the program and replaced them with the palette. The code for setting the palette looks like this, and I've put this at the NMI start location after setting the stack pointer. I've also added 2 instructions to set the high memory page register with page 30. This is the screen that BASIC was using, and it's the one I'm going to draw to now. I'm going to make 2 different sprite routines now. The first will use 2 versions of a sprite for single pixel movement, and I'm going to do it as a very basic compiled sprite with the values of the pixels hard-coded into the routine. I'll call it Draw Sprite, and it will draw a square 7 pixels wide and 7 pixels high in a single colour, and the data for the 2 versions will look like this, where we're drawing the sprite with colour 1 against the background colour, which is 0. So first, I'm going to use a trick that Chris showed me for turning the X coordinate held in the L register and the Y coordinate in H into a screen address. So to do this the hard way, you have to multiply the Y coord by 128 and then add on the X coord divided by 2. For drawing to the higher memory page, you then need to add 32768. Instead of doing all this, you can just set the carry flag and then rotate H right, and then do the same thing with L. If you were drawing to the lower memory page, then you could subtract 32768 from HL at this point by loading BC with negative 32768 and then adding HL with BC. Of course, you could skip all of this and just set HL with the screen address with 1 instruction. That is faster, but it's not always possible. So I like this method a lot. It's very quick, and it also provides an easy way to check which of the 2 versions of the sprite we need to use, because at this point the carry flag will be set if the X coord was an odd number, so we can just use jump carry here if it was odd. Now we can start drawing the sprite. First, the byte aligned version. So load HL with the first byte of the array, and then increment L to move to the next byte on screen. We can use the faster increment L instead of increment HL because the value in H will be the same for each horizontal row of pixels on screen, whether the screen is in the higher or lower memory page. We need to draw 4 bytes of data, and we don't need the last increment L, as we can now jump down to the next row. I'm going to set BC with the right number to add to HL to jump down to the beginning of the next row. And this number is easy to work out. We know that a full row of pixels on screen takes up 128 bytes. So adding 128 to HL would move from our current horizontal screen location to the next row down vertically. We've incremented L 3 times, so all we need to do is subtract 3 from 128, and I'll put the instruction to set BC with 125 right at the beginning of the routine. And now I can copy this block of code for each row of the sprite. We don't need an add HL with BC for the last row. We can just replace it with a return, as this is now finished. We do the nibble shifted version of the sprite in much the same way, using the data from the second array. So we can test it by calling it from the main loop. I'll give it 96 and 128 for the Y and X, roughly in the centre of the screen. I'll assemble it and run it. And we can see that it worked okay. I'll assemble it again with 129 for the X coord to see that the nibble shifted version is working as well. Now we can look at drawing sprites with transparent pixels, and I'm going to go through a very neat way of handling this that Chris showed me. This is a kind of intermediate approach that isn't the fastest, but it does use memory slightly more efficiently than hard coding all your graphic data into bespoke routines. First, we need to prepare some graphic data. If your sprites are small and you don't have many of them, then you could create your data by hand without losing your mind completely, but it's well worth putting in the time to make a tool to automate as much as possible. So first, you'll need to create a mask for the sprite. The mask is made up of just 2 values. 15 decimal or F hex represents a pixel that won't be drawn, your transparent pixel, and 0 represents the pixels that will be drawn. Now we need to interleave the sprite and the mask, and this is much easier if you make a tool to do it for you. Doing it by hand would look like this, taking a byte or 2 pixels at a time of the mask first and then the sprite. You could save your data from your tool as a binary blob, or you could have it in an array like I've done here. And this might seem like a lot of work, but it will make the drawing code very efficient. So this time we're using DE for the X and Y coords, and this will free up HL to use as the pointer to the interleaved mask and sprite data. There will only be one version of the actual drawing code this time, because we can modify the pointer in HL depending on which sprite we want to draw. If the X coord is an even number, then we set HL with the address for the byte-aligned sprite, and if it's odd, then we use the nibble shifted version. To draw with transparency, we're going to merge the pixels on screen with the sprite using the mask. So first, we need to read in the pixels from the screen at the location we're drawing to. So load A with the pixel pair at DE. Then we can apply the mask to this byte by ANDing A with the mask byte in HL. We then increment HL to move the pointer on to the sprite byte and merge that with A by ORing with HL. We then increment HL to move the data pointer ready for the next mask byte and then draw the result of all this to the screen with load DE with A. Finally, we can increment E to move to the next pixel pair on screen. And I can copy this block of code so we have 5 pixel pairs being drawn for the row, and then work out what value we need in BC. This needs to be added to DE, so we can exchange DE with HL, add HL with BC, and then exchange DE and HL back to where they started. I can then copy this entire block for all 8 rows, remove the last add HL with BC, and put in the return. Now I can test it to make sure that it draws okay. And I'll draw a second one offset on top of the first one to make sure that it's drawing with transparency properly. In the next video, I'll look at some simple optimizations and I'll have a go at drawing with the stack pointer. I'll also look at making tools to automate some of this stuff, including creating compiled sprites. So now I want to do a callback to the very first video where I got a very interesting comment from someone who goes by the name of Silly Orb. And they said several things, but one thing they mentioned was quite a big deal to me because for something like the last 10 years or so, if I was down the pub and the subject of video games came up, I had an opinion that I thought made me the smartest guy in the room, which was that if modern programmers making games for the latest PlayStation or Xbox employed the techniques that you had to resort to for drawing graphics on these 8-bit machines, then modern games would look far more impressive. I now know that the reason modern programmers don't use these old techniques is because over the years the speed of CPUs has increased massively compared to the increase in memory speed. So these old techniques could well work out slower than calculating things directly with a modern CPU. This was really interesting to learn. So thank you to Silly Orb. So that's it for this episode. I should have the next one put together in the next month or so. Please like and subscribe and all of that, and I'll see you next time.